Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, which as always comes to you direct from Israel to bring you the voices of the believers who live there, both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians. You may think that the politics of the region makes it very difficult for any sort of reconciliation between the two peoples who share this tiny land. But in fact, as regular listeners to this programme know, God is really at work there, and the numbers of believers are growing, and the desire for reconciliation between these people is also growing. It's a small movement, but it's steadily increasing, and their stories deserve to be told, so that we Christians in the West can support both in prayer and in practical ways. More about how you can do that later in the programme. But first, let me introduce today's guest, Rita. She is a Messianic Jew who came to Israel from America many years ago now. She and her husband Peter are leaders amongst the Messianic movement, and in 2003 Rita felt she should do something to help women who found themselves homeless due to violence or abuse. She set about converting some old buildings on Mount Carmel in northern Israel, where there is a Messianic congregation. She could never have imagined then that a short time later she would be caring for scores of Sudanese women and children, refugees from the war that has ravaged that area of Africa. I've known Rita a long time and watched as her centre has expanded to cope with the numbers of people coming through the doors. The stories of these women is heartbreaking. All are traumatised. Many have been robbed whilst travelling through Egypt to reach the safety of Israel. Others have been raped and arrive pregnant. Rita and her team of volunteers work tirelessly to care for these women and children and the newborn babies that frequently arrive, as you will hear. We met recently in a coffee shop in the German colony area of Haifa, and I asked Rita to describe what's been keeping her busy and occupying her attention over the past few months.
For me, the main passion of my life has been the shelter that the Lord allowed me to run, to build from 2003, and in the last 5 years to bring in women who are fleeing oppression, war, abusive situations, primarily from Sudan, Darfur, and Eritrea in the last few years.
And you've seen so many women coming through your doors.
So many women. And at one point we had a little bit of a, not so much break, but we've had 41 babies born, and so there were no pregnant women there, and I thought, well, maybe God's doing something new with us. And then the doors just began to be opened again to women. The need is huge. In fact, there's really a new phenomenon that is happening, that the women who are coming to us in these last few months have experienced, or at least have family or relatives. Those who are fleeing Eritrea are fleeing a very oppressive dictatorship where the leader has kept his people in what one of the reports I read from perhaps the UNHCR calls it a large prison, the entire country. So when the women and the men attempt to escape, they usually come through Sudan and then through the desert, and having to pay many, many, many thousands of dollars. Unlike the early years when the Sudanese and the Darfurians paid maybe $1,000 to the Bedouins taken to the border, now we're seeing a real horrific, in fact, the label of human trafficking has been put on it, a situation taking place where the smugglers will bring these young girls into their tents and abuse them, rape them, keep them there in bondage to them until they have extorted more money from their family back in Eritrea. Or, as in one of the women who's with us now, they're keeping her husband there. She has no way of giving that kind of money, $10,000. We have prayed for her not to give up hope. In fact, we have a wonderful story that a few weeks ago, one of the women facing that same situation, we prayed, and God mercifully delivered her husband, and we had a big party for him when he crossed the border and went to prison here in Israel. But the real facts of the story is that nobody can do anything. Even the Egyptian government, which of course has gone through its own changes, is not able to monitor what's going on in the desert. And when I bring it up to who know very well the UNHCR, the Ministry of Justice in Israel, they're all very much aware of the terrible situation. So we get the women who eventually are freed, traumatized. Some of them have not been held for that long, but they've gone through trauma in the journey. And so we give them family. In fact, I was at a seminar a few weeks ago with the Ministry of Justice, and here were several judges, religious men wearing their kippot, and the question was posed to me, what do you do for them? And there had been a speaker before me who laid out her whole plan of social workers and treatment. And I just said, well, trying to use language they understood, that we're Messianic Jews, we're faith-based, and we believe that love and treating them through the Word of God is what's going to bring healing. They just looked at me. And since I don't get money from the government, I can say that. A little while later, they all took down my phone number and said, we'll call you when we need somebody. These were the judges. Usually the social workers call, but it was a very sweet moment.
This has been such a new journey for you, Rita. The last few years, you could never have dreamt that you would have been doing this. And as you say, every woman has got her own story to tell. You have them in your care for a long time, but when they leave you, how are you able to help them re-establish their lives?
That's really one of the hardest questions. Some of the women we have kept longer periods because we feel that the nurturing safety of the shelter is what they need spiritually. Some of them have left us and they come back. One wonderful story, we have a single mother who she's able to come back on a weekly basis for congregation. Her children are involved in the youth work, but she lives up here in the north. The ones who go to Arad, the ones who go to Eilat or to Tel Aviv. Of course, we try to follow up with some kind of monitoring whether they're doing all right, to connect them with organizations, to connect them with churches. Usually they find their connections there, but it's a hard one. And some of them who do not have husbands find themselves in very difficult situations, so we still try to help them financially as well, doing what we can. It's hard. It's like seeing your children go off and you can't fix everything, but we do what we can.
If I ask you to put the story of the women that you've been helping, particularly the ones from Sudan and Eritrea, into the bigger picture, why has God put these women across your path? What's going on?
It's a really difficult one because, we look at the scriptures and we know that as Jews, as ones living in this land, knowing why we're here, knowing that the Messiah has brought us, the scripture is very clear, and I know I've quoted this before, that we are to treat the ones who are strangers here as if they were our own, because we were strangers once. And we know that there are scriptures in the Psalms, in Psalm 72, that point to God's heart for the oppressed and for the needy. So, there's refugees everywhere. That's the reality of the world we live in. People are just fleeing from one place to the next, from Pakistan to Afghanistan, from, Croatia to where, we live in a world of upheaval. And I think that we as Jews who have experienced upheaval for thousands of years, the Lord wants us to be in the position to be able to care for the least of them. And that's why I think He's allowed us this privilege of loving them, of taking them into our home and our hearts. And it is a witness to the others in this land. I have had people say it's a holy work. It's an expression in Hebrew to know that what we're doing is holy to the Lord. And I think perhaps the Lord uses us, who again are the least of them in this country. We're not considered very much as Messianic Jews, as a community, but sometimes it's a wonderful reminder that we're the ones who are doing the work of the Lord to care for the least.
You're part of a growing number of Messianic believers now here in the land of Israel, and you and Peter, your husband, are leaders of that movement. And if I was to ask you, Rita, with all the upheaval in the Arab world that we've been watching over the past few weeks and months, what do you really believe God is doing here? How should we be understanding and praying into this situation?
It's a hard one because we're not on the ground, so to speak, but I did receive an email from a pastor friend in Egypt. In this report and in others, we're seeing that things are not boding well, if I may say, for believers. And in fact, we're seeing already in Egypt the signs that a new government, or at least the parties that may be rising to power there, are not at all even favorable to continuing peace with Israel. So I would say in those first few weeks there might have been a real upsurge of, wow, this is wonderful. And of course we want to see people all over the world experiencing more freedom in their personal lives. But I think we would have to say here in Israel, as we read the scriptures, as we look at the seasons and the times, that this is probably going to bring more chaos and probably usher in a season that could be far more dangerous for the people of Israel.
So how should we in the West be praying for you? Because we are obviously inextricably linked, we're all part of the same body, and God's only got one plan for the nations of this world.
I believe the Lord would ask that his body of believers worldwide would really have that revelation that Israel is linked to the destiny of the nations, and so it cannot be viewed as just another political entity, that where we go as a nation is key, and the support. And as we see that support dwindling governmentally and institutionally, even I'm a dual citizen, so my other passport, the American passport, has just been, the president has just delivered a bomb, so to speak, to Israel, in the fact that President Obama has said that Israel must return to its 1967 borders, which means the division of Jerusalem, all sorts of things that would compromise our security. And so in seeing that and knowing that governments may turn, and we know what the scriptures say, more than ever we need our brothers and sisters worldwide who truly know him to be standing with us.
Rita, a Messianic Jew living and working in northern Israel. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. Having listened to Rita's story and her work amongst the refugee Sudanese women and children who find their way to her shelter, you may want to help. You can do this through the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, a Christian charity based in the UK that supports both Jewish and Arab believers living in the Holy Land, people like Rita. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website www.olivetreefund.org or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, PO Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.